Beneath the gilded domes of Topkapi, under a sky that has watched empires rise and fold, there is a silence that the guidebooks cannot translate. Tourists pose against mosaics. Cameras click in courtyards that once echoed with orders and whispers. But behind those painted walls and latticed windows, a very different story unfolded. One of ambition, secrecy and violence dressed in the language of intimacy. The shocking scandals of the Ottoman Harem, the forbidden truth revealed, is not an invitation to prurient curiosity. It is an attempt to listen to the old, careful voices in the margins, the stifled cries recorded by foreign envoys, the terse notes of palace scribes, the rumors that crossed the Mediterranean and stained diplomatic dispatches. What was presented to the world as a garden of pleasure was, in many ways, an engine of statecraft that consumed lives. If you love uncovering hidden history, like and subscribe to see more deep dives into the shadows behind famous facades. The story begins in 1453, when Mehmed II, often called Mehmed the Conqueror, took Constantinople, the Ottoman court transformed. Conquest demanded new structures of control. The palace at Topkapi became the nerve center of an expanding empire, and within its precincts, the harem evolved into something more than a private residence, an institutionalized space designed to manage succession, alliances, and information. The harem's walls both enclosed women and enclosed power. It was as much about lineage and politics as it was about lives lived in seclusion. To understand the scandals, we must first understand the architecture of that power. The Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, was not a ceremonial title, but often the most formidable political actor in the palace. Mothers who produced heirs could exert influence over the divan, court appointments, and foreign policy. The term Valid Sultan literally means Mother Sultan. Eunuchs, especially the chief of the black eunuchs known as the Kislar Aga, controlled access to the inner quarters. These men were both guardians and gatekeepers. They regulated movement, carried messages, and became indispensable intermediaries between the outside world and the secluded women who lived behind heavy doors. The Janissaries, elite infantry units originally recruited through devshirme, were another pillar of palace power, often acting as kingmakers or enforcers when palace order teetered. Inside the harem, women were recruited from diverse regions of the empire, sometimes as captives, sometimes through patronage networks. Renamed and retrained, they learned languages, etiquette, and what would make them valuable. The ability to navigate a confined social world where every friendship, favor, or rival could shift a life's trajectory. The harem had a hierarchy: concubines, the sultan's favorites, mothers of princes, and the valid herself. Some women found means of agency within this system. Others were ground down by it. But what made the harem so consequential, and so dangerous, was that private relations became public stakes. A woman's child was not just a child. A son could be an immediate route to influence and survival. Births were political events. Motherhood could turn a silenced figure into a ruler behind the throne. Conversely, failure to produce a male heir could mean expulsion or worse. Within such compressed stakes, rumor and fear were natural currencies. Chronicles, ambassadorial letters, and later memoirs carry stories of poison, of secret abortions, of conspiracies hatched in the shadows of embroidered curtains. These are not uniform facts. They are fragments of testimony, often contradictory, sometimes sensationalized by outsiders who viewed the Ottoman court with a mixture of fear and fascination. Where the evidence is thin, historians warn caution. Where reports multiply, a pattern of systemic danger begins to emerge. How did the machinery of survival actually work? The process began with selection and renaming. Girls and young women brought into the palace were usually given new names. Their previous family ties were severed in practice, if not legally. Training in the arts of courtliness, music, needlework, etiquette, was combined with instruction in the unspoken rules of influence, who to align with, which eunuch to befriend, how to appear both decorous and indispensable. Eunuchs served as vital nodes of information. The Kislar Aga, as chief eunuch responsible for the imperial harem, wielded disproportionate authority. He controlled audiences, supervised servants, and often acted as a political broker. His favor or disfavor could mean a woman's ascent or descent. Another institution shaped the whole climate, the cafes, commonly translated as the cage. Over time, princes were often kept in seclusion to prevent rival factions from rallying around them, a policy intended to limit civil war, but with corrosive consequences. The cafes warped expectations of rule and succession. Isolated in gilded cages, princes could become dependent on palace agents, enraged by boredom, or consumed by paranoia. The cycle of confinement both protected and destabilized dynastic continuity. And then there was the brutal arithmetic of dynastic survival. Some women became adept political operators. Hürrem Sultan, who rose from concubine to become Suleiman the Magnificent's legal wife and confidant, is often presented as the archetype of agency within constraint. Her story, as told in both Ottoman sources and later European accounts, illustrates how personal bonds could translate into political patronage, influence at court, and philanthropic legacy. She commissioned mosques, endowed foundations, and cultivated networks of patronage that reached beyond the private sphere. Yet her ascent also fed foreign anxieties. Ambassadors and pamphleteers in Europe depicted her as an ominous manipulation of the Sultan, reinforcing Orientalist tropes. If Hürrem's arc shows the possibility of power, Kösem Sultan's life presents its paradox. Born of humble origins, Kösem later became Valid Sultan and, at different times, regent for her sons and grandson. Chronicles portray her as protector of her family's line and a shaper of policy, a woman who could command the divan's attention through networks of loyalty and information. She consolidated power in ways that made her both an administrative asset and a focus of court hatred. Her authority was entangled with violence. Some accounts connect her to coerced successions, to surveillance over rival factions, and finally to her death inside the palace, an ending recorded variously as assassination or as the outcome of palace conspiracies. Some sources report assassination in her private chamber. Historians debate the precise circumstances. The harem scandals are most likely to be remembered for their darker episodes, where rumor hardens into a narrative of mass cruelty. The reign of Ibrahim the Foe, often remembered in contemporaneous letters as volatile and marked by cruel impulses, occupies that center of dread. Foreign ambassadors reported alarming anecdotes about Ibrahim's behavior, and later chroniclers inventory stories of erratic cruelty, arrests, executions, and, most disturbingly, claims that he ordered the killing of concubines and servants. Chronicles report such incidents. Ambassadorial letters also circulated these accounts. These testimonies must be handled with care. Some are corroborated across sources. Others appear as singular, sensational dispatches that could have been amplified by fear, prejudice, or the hunger for lurid detail in foreign courts. Yet even when precise facts remain contested, the recurrent theme is unambiguous. A system that concentrated power in closed spaces created conditions in which physical and institutional violence could become a tool of control. Narratives of palace massacre, sometimes phrased in later retellings as a single horrific night, must be qualified. Several European envoys wrote of mass killings during Ibrahim's reign. Ambassadorial letters claim this. But chronicles differ on numbers and methods. Modern historians often stress that chronicles mixed observation with rumor and moralizing. They urge treating such stories as evidence of a climate of fear rather than always literal, verified events. Still, for contemporaries, and for those who lived under the empire's shadow, these tales functioned as a warning. Unchecked despotism inside palace walls could translate into public catastrophe. The Janissaries, as palace and military actors, feature centrally in this drama. When palace authority faltered, these soldiers sometimes acted as the ultimate arbiter. Revolts and coups staged by the Janissaries could depose sultans. Their support or opposition became decisive. In Ibrahim's case, his overthrow involved military intervention and culminated in his execution. The story, as preserved in multiple sources, suggests a sequence: escalating paranoia and erratic rule, growing discontent among powerful factions, intervention by the Janissaries, and a violent removal from power. How much of the violence was orchestrated within the harem's politics, and how much was the product of broader administrative collapse or military ambition? Historians still debate the proportionality of these forces, but the overlap is undeniable. Palace intrigues and military pressure often fused into a single furnace of political change. Among the most painful features of this history is the anonymity of its victims. Many of those who bore the brunt of palace power, concubines whose names do not survive, eunuchs whose loyalty was compelled by mutilation and legal status, servants and artisans, are attestable only through their absence. Their lives are often summarized in passing. A concubine, a eunuch, a woman who bore a prince and died quietly. The harem produced records about property, endowments, and high-born patrons, but it recorded human beings unevenly. This silence is itself a kind of scandal, a system where so many were essential, but so few were named. How did everyday cruelty turn into policy? Consider the mechanisms by which secrecy was enforced. The harem enforced its own economy of information. Messages were filtered through eunuchs. Marriage and patronage networks were tightly policed. Women who seemed peripheral could become repositories of intimate knowledge. Knowledge about births, about alliances outside the palace, about potential claimants to the throne. To neutralize threats, palace actors used exile, confinement, and sometimes more lethal methods. Scholars cite reports of poisonings and clandestine abortions in the palace. Chronicles report such claims, but these sources often come from observers with limited access or from later writers shaping myths of courtly depravity. What cannot be dismissed is this: the combination of extreme stakes with concentrated secrecy created opportunities where violence could be both covert and decisive. Not every story in the harem reads as pure tragedy. Some women turned confinement into power. Hürrem's philanthropy, Kozum's regency, and the acts of other women who used palace patronage to found mosques, hospitals, and charitable institutions complicate a simple narrative of victimhood. Agency existed within constraint. To speak of the harem is always to hold these two truths together: that the same structure could elevate and devastate, that the same walls that sheltered could also entrap. The duality makes the scandals more morally complex. When a valid intervened to save a province from predatory governors, she could be hailed as a benevolent steward. When she brokered the downfall of a rival, she could be vilified as ruthless. Much depends on perspective. The Western imagination has long been complicit in reshaping these histories into sensationalized fantasies. Orientalist paintings and travelogues projected sexualized and exotic notions onto the harem, flattening a complex institution into a stereotype that answered European appetites. That narrative served political ends too. It justified colonial attitudes by portraying Eastern rulers as decadent, cruel, and irrational. Modern historians have worked to strip away these distortions, emphasizing archival work, Ottoman court records, and a cautious reading of foreign accounts. Still, the popular language of scandal has stuck because the raw ingredients, secrecy, sex, power, and rumor, are irresistible to storytellers. Our task is to honor the dramatic pull while resisting the easy slide into dehumanizing caricature. The consequences of harem politics reached far beyond individual tragedies. Close, Secretive court networks shaped succession in ways that sometimes produced fratricide, the killing of brothers to prevent rival claims, and other brutal methods to secure the throne. The dynastic logic that prioritized centralized stability could, paradoxically, undermine the state's administrative coherence. Episodes of misrule, contested succession, and military indiscipline eroded confidence in governance, sometimes with long-term fiscal and military repercussions. In short, the intimate became instrumental, and the political costs were real. Memory treats the harem in uneven ways. The Topkapi Palace today is a museum. Rooms that once echoed with the small crises of court life are now curated sets of tiles and textiles. Tourists are asked to imagine rather than to inhabit. The museumification of space produces its own kind of silence. Artifacts are preserved while the human stories behind them are often compressed into captions. At the same time, national histories and popular culture have alternately erased and fetishized the harem. For Turks and for students of the Ottoman past, the harem can be a site of pride, shame, or ambivalence. Abroad, it has been used as proof of supposed Eastern decadence, then appropriated by novelists and filmmakers hungry for melodrama. In all these retellings, the figures who do not speak for themselves, anonymous concubines, enslaved servants, eunuchs, are the ones most likely to disappear. If the scandals are shocking, why do we still struggle to name the truth? Because much of what passed as fact was mediated by outsiders, and because internal records were sometimes intentionally oblique. Chronicles could moralize, ambassadors had agendas, and the court itself preserved appearances. The forbidden truth is not a single revelation, but a pattern, a recurring structure where secrecy, concentrated power, and gendered hierarchy created predictable risks. Silence was part of governance. The price of keeping dynastic order was often paid in private suffering. Can we learn lessons for today? It would be an error to draw direct equivalences between an imperial court of centuries past and modern institutions. Yet, certain dynamics are instructive. Systems that centralize decision-making, cloak accountability in layers of secrecy, and place unsupervised authority in the hands of a few often produce the same pathologies: abuse, impunity, and eventually breakdown. Where structures deny voice to large groups and normalize anonymity as a tool of power, the risk of both moral and administrative failure increases. Asking where transparency and accountability are absent matters. Asking who is unnamed in our histories and why matters too. What of the human faces? We must imagine them, not as titillating types, but as complex people. Consider a young woman brought to the palace from a distant province, renamed to erase a past she might barely remember, taught the arts that would make her a valued companion, and then thrust into a world where her fortunes hinge on a single birth. Or the eunuch whose body was altered, who nevertheless accumulated authority, and then became complicit in a system that kept women secluded. Or the mother, who, having secured a son's throne, astutely negotiated alliances to protect his reign while watching rivals disappear. Each of these lives offers a window into how personal aspiration and institutional cruelty often coexisted. We must also weigh the sources. When a Venetian envoy writes of a massacre in the imperial harem, does that mean the event unfolded exactly as described? Not necessarily. Ambassadors wrote for their own courts. They sometimes conflated rumor with witness. When Ottoman chroniclers record deeds of great cruelty, they may be shaping moral lessons, reinforcing the costs of tyranny. Modern historians assemble these pieces critically, triangulating across archives, letters, and legal documents. Where evidence concentrates, our confidence grows. Where it is thin, we must speak of accounts, reports, or claims. That discipline is not cowardice, it is respect for complexity. And yet, even careful historians find themselves haunted by some images that recur. curtains that hid arguments about life and death, the hush of corridors where a whispered order could alter the future of a province, a mother who learned to wield grief as policy. Those images are not meant to titillate, but to indict systems that mask coercion as custom and make silence a requirement for rule. As we leave the palace's shadowed rooms and step back into the courtyard where tourists take photographs, it is worth noting one more paradox. The very spaces that sought to keep information in have become, centuries later, repositories of curiosity. Visitors come to see tiles and textiles. Scholars come to untangle documentation. Descendants of those who served in the palace carry family stories that sometimes contradict the official line. The physical preservation of the harem pales beside the moral task of remembering all who lived and suffered within it. Museums can show objects. History must strive to retrieve the voices that objects alone cannot speak for. So what is the forbidden truth? It is not that scandals occurred. Scandals are a hallmark of any concentrated power. The forbidden truth is that a whole system normalized silence and used intimacy as an instrument of governance. It is that anonymity and secrecy were not accidental byproducts, but functional elements of empire building. That knowledge obliges us to think differently about historical culpability and about modern structures that privilege the few at the expense of the many. Finally, how should we, as modern observers, respond? By insisting on nuance, by refusing to let sensationalism displace careful inquiry, by listening for the absent names and demanding that museums, teachers, and storytellers do the same, and by asking a question that echoes across centuries. Where today do we build systems that reward secrecy over accountability, and who pays for that silence? What do you think? Does the silence of the past still echo in the institutions around us? Comment below and share this video with someone who wants to look beyond the facade of power. If you want to explore primary sources and modern scholarship on these episodes, check the description for a curated list of chronicles, ambassadorial dispatches, and academic works that informed this investigation. And if you found this exploration meaningful, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden structures of history.